In the autumn of 1781, on a narrow spit of land beside a Virginia river, one of the most feared commanders in the British Army stood trapped between an enemy fleet he could not defeat and an enemy army he could not outrun. And the question that hung over the muddy trenches of Yorktown was not whether Britain's finest general would find a way out, but whether the empire itself was about to lose an entire war because of it. Charles Cornwallis had spent nearly 2 decades building a reputation as one of the most capable and aggressive officers in the British military, a nobleman who chose the battlefield over the comforts of the House of Lords, a general whose name alone was enough to unsettle colonial militias who had grown used to losing whenever he appeared on the horizon. And yet by the time the guns fell silent in October of 1781, this same man would be forced to hand over his sword in one of the most consequential surrenders in modern history, an event that did not simply end a battle, but effectively ended Britain's ability to hold on to 13 rebellious colonies across the Atlantic. To understand how a commander this skilled, this experienced, and this respected could be maneuvered into a trap from which there was no escape, it helps to go back to the beginning, to the world that shaped him, and to the string of victories that convinced both his enemies and his own government that Cornwallis was nearly unbeatable in the field, because it was precisely that reputation, and the overconfidence it bred at the highest levels of British strategy, that helped set the stage for his downfall. Born in 1738 into an aristocratic English family with a long tradition of public service, Cornwallis was educated at Eton and later at a military academy in Turin. And rather than settling into a life of privilege, he pursued a career in the army with genuine ambition, purchasing his first commission, as was customary for gentlemen of his class at the time, and steadily earning promotions through demonstrated competence rather than birthright alone. He saw his first significant combat experience during the 7 Years' War in the 1760s, fighting in the German campaigns against France, where he absorbed hard lessons in continental warfare, logistics, and the coordination of infantry and artillery under fire. Experiences that would later prove invaluable, though not always sufficient, on the very different battlefields of North America. By the time the American War of Independence broke out in 1775, Cornwallis held the rank of Major General and was among the most senior and trusted officers sent across the Atlantic to suppress what British leadership initially believed would be a short and containable colonial uprising. From the very start of his American service, Cornwallis distinguished himself through relentless tactical aggression, a willingness to force engagements rather than wait passively, and a genuine skill for battlefield maneuver that outclassed many of his Continental Army opponents in the war's early years. At the Battle of Long Island in 1776, Cornwallis played a central role in the flanking maneuver that helped shatter George Washington's forces and nearly ended the rebellion before it had truly begun. And this early success cemented his reputation among both British commanders and American militia as a general who moved fast, struck hard, and rarely made the kind of hesitant decisions that had slowed down some of his more cautious colleagues. Over the following years, Cornwallis continued to build on this reputation, playing key roles in the capture of Fort Washington, the pursuit of Washington's battered army across New Jersey, and later significant engagements including the Battle of Brandywine in 1777, where his forces once again outflanked and outmaneuvered the Continental Army, forcing Washington to abandon Philadelphia to British occupation. These victories were not accidents of luck. They reflected genuine tactical sophistication, a strong understanding of terrain, and Cornwallis's consistent preference for bold, decisive action over the slower, more methodical approach favored by his commanding officer, General Sir William Howe, and this contrast in temperament would later matter a great deal, because it meant that when Cornwallis was eventually given greater independent command in the southern colonies, he brought with him an instinct for aggressive offense that had served him brilliantly in the North, but would prove far riskier in the different strategic environment of the American South. By 1778, the character of the war had begun to shift. The northern colonies, particularly New England and the mid-Atlantic states, had proven far more difficult to pacify than British strategists initially hoped, and with the entry of France into the war on the American side in 1778, followed later by Spain and the Dutch Republic, the conflict had transformed from a colonial rebellion into a global war that stretched British military and naval resources across multiple continents simultaneously. Faced with this expanding crisis, British strategists turned their attention southward, believing that the southern colonies, with their larger populations of loyalists and their economic reliance on export agriculture vulnerable to naval blockade, offered a more promising path to victory than continued campaigning in the north. This so-called Southern strategy placed Cornwallis at the center of British hopes, and initially, it appeared to be working brilliantly. In 1780, British forces under General Sir Henry Clinton, with Cornwallis serving as his principal subordinate, captured the vital port city of Charleston, South Carolina, in what remains one of the most significant American defeats of the entire war, resulting in the surrender of thousands of Continental Army soldiers. With Charleston secured, Clinton returned to New York and left Cornwallis in command of British operations across the South. And it was here that Cornwallis's reputation as Britain's most feared field commander reached its peak. At the Battle of Camden in August 1780, Cornwallis inflicted a devastating and humiliating defeat on American forces under General Horatio Gates, a battle in which the Continental Army's militia crumbled almost immediately under British pressure, and Gates himself fled the field in a manner that damaged his reputation for the remainder of the war. Camden was, by any measure, a masterclass in battlefield command, and it reinforced the perception both in London and across the American colonies that Cornwallis simply could not be beaten in open combat. Yet even as his tactical victories piled up, deeper strategic problems were beginning to emerge, problems that would ultimately prove more decisive than any single battlefield engagement. The British Southern strategy depended heavily on the assumption that large numbers of loyalist colonists would rise up, organize themselves, and help secure territory once British regulars had cleared it of Continental Army resistance. But in practice, this loyalist support often failed to materialize in the numbers British planners had hoped for, and in many areas, brutal fighting between loyalist and patriot militias created a cycle of local violence and retribution that made pacification even more difficult rather than easier. Meanwhile, American commanders in the South, chastened by the disaster at Camden, adopted a new and far more effective approach under the leadership of General Nathanael Greene, who took command of the remaining Continental forces in the region. Rather than attempting to confront Cornwallis in the kind of decisive pitched battle that had proven so costly at Camden, Greene pursued a strategy of calculated attrition, dividing his forces, drawing British troops into extended pursuits across difficult terrain, and forcing Cornwallis to spend his resources, his supplies, and his soldiers' strength chasing an enemy that refused to stand and fight on unfavorable terms. This approach reached a critical turning point at the Battle of Cowpens in January 1781, where American forces under General Daniel Morgan employed a brilliant tactical formation that lured British troops under Colonel Banastre Tarleton into a devastating trap, resulting in one of the most complete American tactical victories of the entire war and the destruction of a significant portion of Cornwallis's light infantry and cavalry forces. Enraged and determined to destroy Greene's army before it could recover, Cornwallis made a fateful decision that would define the remainder of his southern campaign. He ordered his own supply wagons burned, stripping his army down to its essential fighting equipment in order to move faster and pursue Greene's forces with maximum speed across the Carolina backcountry. This decision reflected the same aggressive, decisive instinct that had won him so many battles in the past, but it also carried enormous risk, because it meant that Cornwallis's army now had virtually no margin for error when it came to supplies, reinforcements, or the ability to sustain a prolonged campaign far from friendly territory. The pursuit that followed pushed both armies to the limits of physical endurance through swollen rivers, difficult terrain, and increasingly hostile country, and it finally culminated in the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in March 1781, where Cornwallis's forces did succeed in driving Greene's army from the field, technically securing another tactical victory, but at a devastating cost. British casualties at Guilford Courthouse were so severe, roughly a quarter of Cornwallis's entire force, that the victory proved strategically hollow, and even prominent voices in the British Parliament, including the statesman Charles James Fox, would later observe that another victory of this kind would ruin the British Army entirely. This was the paradox that increasingly defined Cornwallis's southern campaign. He kept winning battles, and yet each victory left his own army weaker, more exhausted, and further from any realistic path toward pacifying the southern colonies as British strategy had originally envisioned. Rather than continuing to chase Greene's elusive forces through the Carolinas, Cornwallis made another consequential decision in the spring of 1781, choosing to march his battered army northward into Virginia, believing that this wealthier and strategically significant colony offered better prospects for supply, reinforcement, and ultimately for cutting off the flow of men and resources that had been sustaining the Continental Army's southern operations. This decision would prove to be the single most important strategic error of Cornwallis's entire American campaign, though its consequences would not become fully apparent for several more months. Operating in Virginia through the summer of 1781, Cornwallis found himself increasingly disconnected from clear strategic direction, receiving conflicting instructions from his superior, General Clinton, who remained in New York and grew increasingly concerned about the possibility of a combined American and French assault on that city, the primary British stronghold in North America. Clinton repeatedly urged Cornwallis to establish a fortified naval base somewhere along the Virginia coast, both to support future operations and to provide a secure point from which troops could be evacuated by sea if necessary. And after considering several locations, Cornwallis eventually settled his forces at Yorktown, a small tobacco port situated on a peninsula bordered by the York River. Believing it offered a defensible position with direct access to the sea and the protection of the Royal Navy, which had maintained naval superiority along the American coast for most of the war. This assumption that British naval power would remain dominant and could resupply or evacuate his army whenever necessary represented the final and most fatal miscalculation of Cornwallis's entire campaign, because it failed to account for a rapidly shifting balance of naval power that was unfolding thousands of miles away in the Caribbean and the Atlantic. While Cornwallis fortified his position at Yorktown throughout the summer of 1781, an extraordinary sequence of coordination was quietly unfolding among American and French commanders that would ultimately spring the trap that closed around him. George Washington, who had spent years frustrated by his inability to force a decisive engagement against British forces in the north, recognized an unprecedented opportunity when he learned that a French naval fleet under Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse was preparing to sail from the Caribbean toward the Chesapeake Bay, and in coordination with the French commander, the Comte de Rochambeau, whose forces had been stationed in Rhode Island. Washington made the bold decision to abandon his long-standing plans for an assault on British-held New York, and instead march the combined American and French armies rapidly southward toward Virginia, a movement that required extraordinary secrecy, discipline, and logistical coordination across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain, all while keeping British commanders in New York convinced that an attack on their own position remained imminent. This deception worked remarkably well, and by the time General Clinton realized the true destination of the combined Allied army, it was already too late to meaningfully intervene. Simultaneously, the naval dimension of this coordinated trap was falling into place with equally decisive effect. In early September 1781, Admiral de Grasse's French fleet engaged a British naval force under Admiral Thomas Graves in what became known as the Battle of the Chesapeake, a naval engagement that, while not overwhelmingly decisive in terms of ships sunk or destroyed, succeeded in driving the British fleet away from the Chesapeake Bay and securing French naval control of the very waters that Cornwallis had been counting on for resupply and potential evacuation. This naval battle, often overshadowed in popular memory by the land campaign that followed, was arguably the single most decisive engagement of the entire war, because it severed Cornwallis's connection to the sea and transformed Yorktown from a defensible coastal stronghold into an isolated trap with no realistic avenue of escape. By the time Washington and Rochambeau's combined forces arrived outside Yorktown in late September 1781, joined by additional French troops delivered by de Grasse's fleet, Cornwallis found himself facing a combined Allied force of nearly 20,000 soldiers, vastly outnumbering his own army of roughly 8,000 exhausted and increasingly undersupplied troops, with no path of retreat by land and no rescue possible by sea. The siege that followed unfolded with grim inevitability. Allied engineers, employing the methodical siege tactics that had been refined over centuries of European warfare, constructed a series of parallel trenches that gradually closed the distance toward the British fortifications, while Allied artillery subjected Yorktown's defenses to sustained and increasingly devastating bombardment. Cornwallis, ever the aggressive tactician even in desperate circumstances, attempted several sorties and counterattacks in hopes of disrupting the Allied siege works, and he made one final, almost desperate attempt to escape across the York River under cover of darkness, a plan that was ultimately thwarted by a sudden and violent storm that scattered his boats before the crossing could be completed. With his defenses crumbling under continuous bombardment, his troops suffering from disease and dwindling supplies, and no prospect of relief from either land or sea, Cornwallis recognized by mid-October that his position had become untenable, and on October 17, 1781, he requested terms of surrender from Washington. 2 days later, on October 19, 1781, the formal surrender ceremony took place, and in a detail that has become one of the most memorable moments of the entire war, Cornwallis himself, citing illness, did not personally attend the ceremony, instead sending his deputy, General Charles O'Hara, to formally surrender the British sword, an absence that some historians have interpreted as a final, quiet acknowledgement of the personal weight of this defeat for a commander who had built his entire career on victory. The surrender at Yorktown did not immediately end the American Revolutionary War in a formal sense, as scattered fighting continued in various theaters for months afterward, but its political and psychological impact was immediate and profound. News of the defeat reached London in November 1781, and it landed with devastating force on a British political establishment that had already grown weary of a costly, unpopular, and increasingly unwinnable war being fought against a rebellion that had now drawn in most of Europe's major naval powers. When Prime Minister Lord North received word of the surrender, he is reported to have reacted with visible distress, understanding immediately that this defeat represented not merely a military setback, but the effective collapse of Britain's political will to continue prosecuting the war in America. Within months, the North government fell, replaced by a new administration far more inclined toward negotiating peace, and these negotiations would eventually culminate in the Treaty of Paris in 1783, through which Great Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States of America. For Cornwallis personally, the surrender at Yorktown did not end his military or political career, a fact that surprises many people encountering this story for the first time, because despite this significant defeat, the British government continued to recognize his genuine tactical skill and administrative competence, later appointing him to senior positions including Governor-General of India and Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, roles in which he implemented significant and consequential reforms, demonstrating that his reputation, while forever marked by Yorktown, was not permanently destroyed by it. Understanding how Britain's most feared field commander in America came to be outmaneuvered at Yorktown requires appreciating that his defeat was not primarily the result of any single tactical mistake or momentary lapse in judgment on the battlefield itself, but rather the product of a much larger strategic failure that unfolded across an entire theater of war spanning thousands of miles. Involving the coordinated efforts of American and French land and naval forces, operating with a level of secrecy, speed, and cooperation that British commanders simply failed to anticipate or counter in time. Cornwallis was, by nearly every account from his contemporaries, and by the judgment of military historians in the centuries since, a genuinely skilled and courageous battlefield commander, and his string of victories across the Southern campaign stands as a testament to real tactical ability rather than mere reputation. But the war in America was never going to be decided by tactical brilliance alone, and Cornwallis's downfall illustrates one of the most enduring lessons in military history: that even the most capable commander can be outmaneuvered not on the battlefield itself, but through superior strategic coordination, patient positioning, and the kind of cooperation between Allied land and naval forces that transforms isolated tactical victories into ultimate strategic irrelevance. The trap that closed around Cornwallis at Yorktown was built not in a single afternoon of fighting, but through months of coordinated planning between Washington, Rochambeau, and de Grasse, through the quiet deception that kept Clinton guessing in New York, and through a naval battle in the Chesapeake that received far less popular attention than the siege that followed it, but that ultimately decided the outcome before the first siege trench was even dug. It stands today as one of history's clearest illustrations of how even Britain's most feared soldier, a man whose name alone had once been enough to scatter armies, could be systematically outmaneuvered not by matching his aggression with equal force, but by patiently closing every avenue of escape until victory became, for the first time in his long and celebrated career, simply impossible to achieve.